Hello and welcome to this video for ESA's 2024 virtual conference. Thank you so much, Parissa, for the opportunity to think anew about this paper and about the award and the opportunity it afforded me. I'm Gavin Weedon. I'm an associate professor in Sociology of Sport, Health and the Body at Nottingham, Trent University. And if you're watching this, I'm imagining that you're at this year's virtual conference and perhaps that you're a graduate student considering submitting to the award. And if that's the case, I'll happily start where I might have finished this talk and say that I absolutely encourage you to submit your work to the paper award. I think perhaps for mostly it can be a really useful deadline to work towards, given the competing pressures and deadlines that come with graduate study. Sometimes these sorts of things can fall by the wayside. And of course, if you do win or you're given an honourable mention, then it's a great way to meet people at the conference in person, to have that common point of reference. I still remember meeting several people whose names I knew from papers and books, but wouldn't have otherwise started conversations with, in all likelihood, in many cases, if we didn't have that common point of reference. This was back in Glasgow in 2012. And I still have memories of being lightly shuffled off stage when receiving it. I'm going to talk a bit about the paper, where it came from, why I wrote it, how it sits with my work currently. The paper I wrote for the GPA in 2012 was called The Writings on the Firewall, Assessing the Promise of Open Access Publishing for a Public Sociology of Sport. And I'd written it whilst I was a PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And one of the virtues of that program was that you get to take courses not just all across the university, but in this case, I was taking a course across town at Simon Fraser University with Professor Rick Grunow, an incredible teacher and sociologist of sport, who was giving a doctoral class called History of Communications Theory. And it was a tour through the canon of Western social theory, and I learned more in that class than I would have ever been able to write and contain in any one term paper. So I took a more narrower interest in critiques of digital communications, economic, political and cultural critiques. I was interested then and still am in those. And I was becoming increasingly interested in and aware of academic work in terms of the labour of submitting articles and doing revisions and, crucially, signing publishing contracts at this time. And Rick's class had me thinking about that in the context of knowledge and academic knowledge as a commons and as contested, as well as being a public good. And after a chat, he recommended some readings to me, and I resolved to get into it. And the result was the paper that I submitted to ESA, and I ended up publishing it the following year. Ultimately, it's a critique of the political economy of academic journal publishing, in which I also evaluate the various models of open access publishing that were being put forward to redress those issues in the UK at the time, particularly in the UK, not only. So the first argument I made was that what happens to research once it enters academic journals, once it's been written and submitted, can be understood through the concept of accumulation by dispossession. This is the Marxist geographer David Harvey's concept that he used really to think about the dispossession of land and wealth. And I was thinking about it in the context of knowledge. And the way I understood it then and now is that knowledge that's produced and peer-reviewed and edited by academic researchers for the benefit of other researchers and for wider publics, once you submit it and sign those publishing contracts, it enters into this privatized zone of capital accumulation as soon as we sign off. And in that moment, the public good that's perhaps even coming via a publicly funded university and is likely inheriting from traditions that might be hundreds or thousands of years old, it's seized by that publishing company, who restrict access to it, assume ownership of it, while accepting only shallow legal responsibilities for its content, and having done so, then release it back into that privatised mainstream of capital accumulation, lock it behind a paywall, and then sell it back to the libraries of the universities who produced it in the first place, whose universities produced it in the first place. It seemed to me a ludicrous state of affairs, and still does, more so when I learned when I was writing it that over 60% of academic journals were owned by just 4 publishers. And they were making enormous profits, some 30%, 35% on revenues, in some cases over £1 billion a year. Where was it coming from? Largely from university libraries. And this seemed especially egregious to me in the early age of austerity, 2011, 2012. Many universities were struggling financially. Tuition fees have been tripled in the UK for undergraduates. And it seemed to me, like I say, a ludicrous, egregious state of affairs. And while it might have seemed necessary for publishing to be outsourced from universities in the age of the printing press, which requires specialised skills, access to that mode of production, in a digital age, the necessity of external publishing companies, corporatised publishing companies for journals to do this, most of which are now digitised, was called into question. I didn't talk about book publishing it's a separate matter in this article. So, if we zone out, I came to have a vision of this system where academic research is produced in universities, and from which it then exits into this process of commodification. And when it leaves, it's no longer available, even for the colleagues or the students of that academic to read, unless their library subscribes to one of these journals. And I came to ask, do they truly add value that is composite to the profits that are being recorded and the losses that are being recorded by universities? And through David Harvey's ideas and through other people that were writing about the digital commons, I argue that they do not, and sought out alternatives. As an aside, I do remember presenting this work at UBC as a PhD student, and one professor asking me, in light of my analysis, well, how do you intend to get a job? Which wasn't entirely in the spirit that I was trying to create, but it was a fair question, right? Because getting a research-focused job in academia almost always increasingly requires a publication record. And often, even if you do know that some journals are prestigious or esteemed or historic or specialised for particular areas of research, seldom do people know about their ownership structures and where the money goes that university libraries are paying. The second argument I made in this paper was about publishing companies needing to be part of the critique of the neoliberal or corporate university. This was a literature that I had becoming more and more familiar with, and within our own field, sociology of sport. I'd read Andrew Sparks and Alan Berner and David Andrews and Michael Silk and others make their criticisms of the corporate university, specifically the fate of the academic who enters into this system and is reduced to a kind of promotional subject, who has to fight so hard to not be pulled into the vortex of committing themselves to the kind of metrics and audit-based system that requires so many publications, so many grant applications, and so on. It requires an active effort to retain a commitment to the reasons that you wanted to do this work in the first place. I think the issues and meanings that first brought you to want to have anything to do with the university. And I thought that the publishing industry got off quite lightly in those critiques within critical university studies, given their role in creating these kind of privatized research infrastructure. So I wrote about that, more of a Foucault-inspired critique of neoliberal subjectification than the Marxist-inspired critique of political economy that had gone before it. I never reconciled those two in the paper. I didn't find that kind of the idea of alienation from the products of academic labour was really getting the same purchase on what I thought was happening, talking to other academics at the time. And so, I took a different tact in that section. Finally, last thing I did in the paper was evaluate those different open access models, because this is what drew my attention and one of the reasons I wrote the paper. There were these proposals to try and redress this state of affairs that I've just outlined. And the one that was taken up most widely and was, I think, dubiously called the gold model at the time, who wouldn't vote for the gold model, is the one that sees researchers, institutions or funding bodies pay to a publishing company in order to make their research available freely to the public. Crucially, unlike alternative models that were being put forward, in that one, the publisher's income stream is axiomatic, right? It's that arrangement unchanging and beyond reproach. And I think that's one of the reasons that so many that still do work in this area find it unsatisfying. As another aside, serendipitously this morning, I was searching for an article for a lecture that I'm writing and was met with restricted access. The article was embargoed by the publisher, and it just brought to mind that all of these issues are still very much contemporary. So in terms of how this sits with more contemporary issues, this paper is 12 years old. One way it manifests today that you might be familiar with or want to be familiar with is in the emergence of predatory journals who charge fees for publishing without doing the hallmark work of peer review and editing. And they focus instead, and this is the classic critique of commodification, on how many papers can they publish. And many of us have had that invitation that hopefully goes to the spam or junk folder of our emails, but it's still tugging at our egos from the a journal of art, science and engineering or something equally vague and nebulous, and they're soliciting a paper from you, just any paper, perhaps with some discount to those fees. And in the digitized landscape where journals are not limited, at least theoretically limited by issues or volumes and pages, and where publishing in journals remains a leading currency for academics and for their institutions, I still think there are discussions to be had about what happens to the research that we do. I think that predatory journals is just the thin end of the wedge, if you like. It's a major issue, but it shouldn't come at the expense of thinking about the orthodox mode of publishing that we still all participate in. In terms of my interests, last thing I'll say is that I've still retained a strong interest in critical university studies, maybe more so since I finished my PhD and took an academic position. Still really interested in the politics of knowledge production, which this was, in dialogue with for sure, and in the digital condition and its discontents, in the sort of, we seem so far away from the 1990s optimism about the internet when we come to confront particularly the political economy of digital communications as I encountered it here. And so even though this stuff has never really been at the center of my research, the issues and the approaches that were raised in bringing it together certainly were. That's it. The last thing I'll say is, please, if you want to talk about anything I've raised in this video, please do say hi. I'd be more than happy to talk. Have a wonderful time at the ESA's virtual conference. You can contact me by email at Nottingham Trent University.